Before Christopher was baptized, he was called Reprobus, meaning outcast, but afterwards he was called Christophoros, the Christ-bearer. He bore Christ in 4 ways, namely on his shoulders when he carried him across the river, in his body by mortification, in his mind by devotion, and on his mouth by confessing Christ and preaching him. Christopher was a Canaanite by birth, a man of prodigious size. He was 12 feet tall, and fearsome of visage. According to some accounts of his life, it happened one day, when he was in the presence of a certain Canaanite king, that the idea came to him of going in quest of the greatest prince in the world, and staying with him. He came to a mighty king who was regarded generally as the world's greatest ruler. When this king saw Christopher, he received him gladly and made him a member of his court. Then one day the court jester sang some ditty before the king, in which frequent mention was made of the devil. The king was a Christian, and made the sign of the cross on his forehead when he heard the devil spoken of. Christopher noticed this, and wondered why the king did it, and what the sign meant. He asked the king about it, and, when the ruler did not answer, said to him, "Unless you answer my question, I will not stay with you any longer." The king thus pressed, told him, "Whenever I hear the devil mentioned, I defend myself with this sign, for the fear of the devil might get some power over me and do me harm." Christopher, if you're afraid of being harmed by the devil, this proves that he is greater and more powerful than you are, or you wouldn't be afraid of him. Therefore I am frustrated in my hope that I had found the greatest and most powerful Lord in the world. So now farewell. I'll go and look for the devil, accept him as my master, and become his servant." Christopher left the king and went in search of the devil. He was going through a desert when he saw a great host of soldiers, and one of them, fiercer and more terrible than the rest, came to him and asked him where he was going. Christopher answered, "I am looking for the Lord Devil. I want to take him as my master." The other said to him, "I'm the one you're looking for." Christopher was happy to hear this and pledged himself to serve him forever, acknowledging him as his Lord and master. They marched along the highway until they came to a cross erected at roadside. When the devil saw it, he was terror-stricken, left the road, and led Christopher over a wild and desolate tract before returning to the road. Christopher was surprised at this, and asked the devil what made him so afraid that he left the high road and took another way through the rough wilderness. The devil refused to state his reason, and Christopher said, "Unless you tell me what this is about, I shall leave you immediately." The demon, no longer able to evade the question, said, There was a man named Christ, was nailed to a cross, and when I see the sign of his cross, I am filled with terror and run away." Christopher, "Well then, this Christ, whose sign you dread so much, is greater and more powerful than you are. Therefore I have labored in vain, and have not yet found the greatest prince in the world. So goodbye to you, I'm leaving you and going in search of Christ." He looked long and far for someone who could give him word of Christ. Finally he came upon a hermit who preached Christ to him and instructed him diligently in the Christian faith. He said to Christopher, "This king whom you wish to serve requires that you do his will in many ways. For instance, you will have to fast frequently." Christopher: "Let him require some other form of obedience. That one I just can't do." Again the hermit: You will also have to offer him many prayers." Christopher: "I don't even know what that means, so I can't perform that kind of service." The hermit then asked him, "Do you know the famous river where many people, trying to get across, go under and perish?" "Yes, I do," said Christopher. The hermit: "You're big enough and strong enough. Go and dwell by the river, and if you help those who wish to cross it, that will greatly please Christ the King whom you wish to serve, and I hope he might show himself to you there." Christopher: "Good! That kind of service I can give, and I promise to serve him that way." He went to the river and built himself a shelter to live in. Instead of a staff, he used a long pole to steady himself in the water, and carried across all those who wished to go. Many days later he was resting in his shelter, when he heard a child's voice calling him. "Christopher, come out and carry me across." He jumped to his feet and went out, but found no one. He went indoors and again heard the same voice calling him, but ran out and again saw no one. The third time he responded to the same call and found a child standing on the river bank. The child begged him to carry him across the river, and Christopher lifted him to his shoulders, grasped his great staff, and strode into the water. But little by little the water grew rougher, and the child became as heavy as lead. The farther he went, the higher rose the waves, and the weight of the child pressed down upon his shoulders so crushingly that he was in dire distress. He feared that he was about to founder, but at last he reached the other bank. Setting the child down, he said to him, "My boy, you put me in great danger, and you weighed so much that if I had had the whole world on my back, I could not have felt it a heavier burden." The child answered him, "Don't be surprised, Christopher. You were not only carrying the whole world, you had him who created the world upon your shoulders. I am the Christ your King, to whom you render service by doing the work you do here. And if you want proof that what I am saying is true, when you go back to your little house, plant your staff in the earth, and tomorrow you will find it in leaf and bearing fruit." With that the child vanished. Christopher crossed over and thrust his staff into the earth near his shelter. The next morning he rose and found the staff bearing leaves and fruit like a palm tree. After that, Christopher went to Samos, a city in Lycia. He did not understand the language spoken there, and prayed the Lord to make him able to understand it. As he prayed, the judges thought he was insane and left him alone. But when the favor he had prayed for was granted, He covered his face and went to the place where Christians were being tortured and executed, to speak to them and give them courage in the Lord. One of the judges struck him in the face, and Christopher, uncovering his face, said, "If I were not a Christian, I would quickly have revenge for this insult." Then he planted his staff in the earth, and prayed the Lord that it might burst into leaf and thus help to convert the people. Leaves sprouted instantly, and 8,000 men believed and became Christians. The king now sent 200 soldiers to bring Christopher to him, but they found him in prayer and were afraid to tell him why they had come. The king sent as many more, but they, when they found him praying, prayed with him. Christopher rose and said to them, "For whom are you looking?" Seeing his face, they asked, "The king sent us to bring you to him in bonds." "Christopher, if I did not wish to go, you could not take me, bound or not," they said. "Well then, if you don't want to come, take your leave and go wherever you wish, and we'll tell the king that we could not find you anywhere." "Not so," he replied. "I will go with you." So Christopher converted the soldiers to the faith, and had them tie his hands behind his back, and present him, thus bound, to the king. The sight of him terrified the king, who fell from his seat. His servitors raised him, and asked Christopher his name and country of origin. Christopher replied, "Before baptism I was called Reprobus, but now I am called Christopher." The king, "You have taken a foolish name, calling yourself after Christ, who was crucified and could do nothing to save himself, and now can do nothing for you. Now then, you trouble-making Canaanite, why do you not sacrifice to our gods?" Christopher, "You are rightly called Dagnus, because you are the death of the world and the devil's partner, and your gods are the work of men's hands." The king, "You were brought up among wild beasts, and you can do only the works of savages, and talk only the things unknown to men. Now, however, if you are ready to sacrifice, I will bestow great honors upon you. If not, you will be tortured to death." Christopher refused to sacrifice, and the king put him in jail. As for the soldiers whom he had sent after Christopher, he had them beheaded for the name of Christ. Now the king had 2 shapely young women, one named Nicaea and the other Aquilina, put into the cell with Christopher, promising them large rewards if they succeeded in seducing him. Christopher quickly saw through the stratagem and knelt to pray. When the women tried to arouse him by stroking him and putting their arms around him, he stood up and said to them, "What are you trying to do, and for what reason were you sent in here?" The 2 were frightened by the radiance of his face and said, "Saint of God, pity us. Make us able to believe in the God whom you preach." Word of this reached the king, who had the women brought to him and said, "So you too have been seduced? I swear by the gods that unless you sacrifice to the gods, you will die an awful death." They answered, "If your will is that we offer sacrifice, have the streets cleared, and order all the people into the temple." This done, they went into the temple, loosened their girdles, and threw them around the necks of the idols, pulling them to the ground and reducing them to dust. Then they said to the assistants, "Call your doctors, and let them heal your gods." By order of the king, Aquilina was then hung up by the wrists, and a huge stone was tied to her feet, thus breaking all her limbs. When she had breathed her last in the Lord, her sister Nicaea was thrown into the fire, but when she emerged unscathed, she was beheaded at once. Christopher was then brought before the king, who ordered him to be beaten with iron rods, and to have an iron helmet heated in fire placed on his head. Then he had an iron chair made. The saint was bound into it. Then a fire was lighted underneath, and pitch thrown on the flames. But the chair crumbled like wax, and Christopher came away from it unharmed. Then the king had him lashed to a pillar, and ordered 400 bowmen to shoot arrows at him. But the arrows hung in mid-air, and not a single one of them could touch him. But when the king, thinking that he had been mortally wounded, came to mock him, suddenly one of the arrows came through the air, turned back, and struck the tyrant in the eye, blinding him. Christopher said to him, "Tyrant, I will be dead by tomorrow. Then make a paste with my blood and rub it in your eyes, and you will recover your sight." By the king's order, the saint was led away to the place of execution, where after praying he was beheaded. The king took a little of his blood and rubbed it on his eyes, saying, "In the name of God and Saint Christopher," and his sight was restored immediately. Then he was baptized, and issued a decree that whoever blasphemed against God or Saint Christopher was to be beheaded at once. Ambrose in his preface says of this martyr, "O Lord, you granted such a wealth of virtue and such grace of teaching to Christopher, that by his gleaming miracles he recalled 48,000 men from the error of paganism to the cult of Christian dogma. Nicaea and Aquilina had been engaged in prostitution in a public brothel, but he won them over to the practice of chastity, and schooled them to receive the crown of martyrdom. For this he was strapped into an iron chair in the middle of a blazing fire, but feared no harm from the heat. For a whole day the storm of arrows shot by the soldiers could not pierce him. Yet one arrow struck the executioner in the eye, and the blessed martyr's blood mixed with earth restored his sight, and by removing the body's blindness also illumined his mind. For the saint besought your forgiveness, and by his supplications obtained the cure of diseases and infirmities.